If you guys have seen this channel before, you know I really do politics. I don't deal with psychology, except when I deal with the politics of psychology or the psychology of politics. And these two things do overlap in a really dynamic and interesting way. One reason being that both in politics and in psychology, we have to separate carefully the problem from the perception of the problem. Whichever problem we happen to be dealing with, we have to deal with very carefully what is the problem itself, and then how did this come to be noticed, how did this come to be perceived, how did this come to be defined. Who is it that perceives it as a problem, and who is it that perceives it as something normal or even as positive, as not a problem at all. And these things may come back to cultural values. They may come back to very complex and difficult to pin down factors. Now, in talking about sociopathy, in talking about people being sociopaths, in talking about people having antisocial personality disorder, who perceives something like empathy? Who perceives compassion? And who fails to perceive it? You guys probably know, and if you don't know, you don't need to look at the particular example. There's been a lot of talk lately about a certain young man not feeling sad when he went to someone's funeral, a relative's funeral, and whether or not this is a symptom of being a sociopath, this kind of thing. I've been to many funerals in my life, and at some of them I felt more upset than others for reasons that are completely rational, have to do with how old the person was when they died, the situation, the circumstances of their death, whether their death was a surprise or not, and how I felt about it, what it meant in my life, obviously. From a selfish perspective, how upsetting this is to me is going to change with my situation, my relationship to the person, so on and so forth. But, you'd have to be crazy. That's what we're talking about here. You'd have to be crazy to pretend that the sudden death of a 12-year-old in a car accident is equivalent to someone dying when they're 80 years old, and maybe they already knew 5 years in advance that they had a disease that was progressing, and they talked to everyone, let everyone know in advance they were going to die, and it didn't come as any surprise at all. So we can't look at this as a simple check mark on a list. Do you or do you not have this symptom for being a sociopath? Do you or do you not appropriately feel empathy, compassion, what have you? Now, in my own life, I remember very clearly 2 funerals I went to at which I was not saddened or aggrieved by the person's death. But what I was emotionally available for the people who were grieving. So at those 2 funerals, the way I was perceived by other people there was very, very different. Well, you'll see what I have to say in just a moment. In one case, my grandmother was utterly shattered by the death of her husband. The death of her second husband, who was not my grandfather. And most of the other people at that funeral were just kind of self-absorbed and distracted, and they weren't spending any time with her. They weren't spending any time with my grandmother. Now, I wasn't upset or sad, basically because he died at a very, very old age, didn't come as a surprise, etc. I had a good relationship with him also. It wasn't the situation that he died and I was left feeling, oh, if only I had apologized for something. There wasn't any kind of sense of unfinished business. But everyone else, including my own father, notably, they were kind of walking around in a stupor at that funeral. I remember the different attitudes of people there. And I really sat with my grandmother and talked to her and listened to her, and I was comforting to her. Frankly, just because I could be. I really wasn't consumed by or distracted with, my own grief in any way. And I can remember maybe 2 people at the funeral kind of shaming me, kind of saying something negative about me because I wasn't weeping and I wasn't crying. I wasn't distraught in the way that they were. I remember one other person saying something very strange to defend me, this other kind of cousin of mine, saying, oh, well, everyone grieves in their own way. And after the funeral was over, a couple days later or something, I remember my grandmother then went out of her way to really say, this was the one guy who really comforted me. This was the one guy who was really compassionate and empathetic and really helped me out when I was falling apart. It wasn't so much at the funeral. It was after sort of reception social event after the funeral. And something similar happened not that long later. There was another funeral for someone who was maybe like my great uncle, a pretty distant relation, where again my aunt, I really sort of spent time with her and was kind of solid for her and there for her in a way that, as it happened at that funeral, so nobody else was, for whatever. And I remember her really, she thanked me directly, and she said, she really recognized. Now, so in this situation, I mean, at either funeral, how do people perceive me? How do people perceive the problem? And what is the problem? Is the problem that I'm not weeping at my grandfather's funeral? Is it a problem? Is it a problem, or is it something positive? And I took it as a positive opportunity to kind of be there for and comfort my grandmother. Does that make me more compassionate or less compassionate than someone who's just weeping and sobbing and consumed with their own grief, or someone who's just in a more self-centered way, feeling stunned and off balance and inarticulate and doesn't know what to say and just feels vulnerable and afraid? Some people are just afraid of death. They're just freaked out, and they aren't playing that role I played for my grandmother. Maybe judgments of good and bad, maybe judgments of sane and insane, selfish and selfless, sociopath and being generous of spirit. Maybe those judgments are actually really inappropriate and really counterproductive in this context. And I mention it because I'd like you to consider that they may be inappropriate and counterproductive in every context. So I'm going to read for you quickly what I think is the main plank, the core of the formal psychiatric definition of antisocial personality disorder, what is now in popular culture referred to as being a sociopath. And I think we can reflect on that a little bit. But, I mean, the main leitmotif I want to come back to here again and again is this question of what is the problem and who perceives the problem? Who perceives something and defines it and adjudges it as compassion or as a lack of compassion? If we say that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, how can we fail to recognize that being compassionate is a similar aesthetic judgment and is a similar, culturally loaded judgment? At my grandfather's funeral, was I being the most compassionate person, or was I being the least compassionate person? Maybe both. Maybe it's a stupid and deeply flawed question. So this is from the text of the DSM-5 criteria for antisocial personality disorder. This is not ancient history. This is, I believe, the most recent revision from April 2012. And I got this text from a university website, from the Department of Psychology at a formal academic institution. So I believe this is correct text. This is not from Wikipedia. However, by all means, if you have any concerns, read the full text yourself. I'm not going to read every word of this for obvious reasons. But it opens by saying, to diagnose antisocial personality disorder, the following criteria must be met. And then the headings and subheadings are grouped in a peculiar way. We open with 4 criteria, which are the 4 criteria I'm going to read. And then the article does continue through B, C, D, through a series of other personality traits that I'm not going to discuss here. So again, I'm not reading the entire definition to you. But it opens what I think is the most fundamental and broad definition of what this personality disorder is supposed to be. A. So you must have, these criteria you must have in order to be diagnosed with this, you must have A, significant impairments in personality functioning manifest by 1, impairments in self-functioning, such as A or B to follow. A, impairments of identity, such as egocentrism, self-esteem derived from personal gain, power, or pleasure, period. B, self-direction, meaning an impairment in self-direction, goal setting based on personal gratification, absence of pro-social internal standards associated with failure to conform to lawful or culturally normative ethical behavior, period. All right, so I'm going to continue. Pause. self-esteem derived from personal gain. What percentage of people on Earth experience self-esteem derived from personal gain? Is it 50%? Is it 80%? Is it 90%? How broadly or how narrowly do we define personal gain? If I do something charitable, if I hand out sacks of rice to starving people and help the poor, I may experience that as a form of pleasure, power, personal gain. There are people who are egocentric, who are engaged in research, trying to find the cure for cancer, or handing out sacks of rice to starving people. I may gain self-esteem and a sense of pleasure, gain, power from studying languages, studying philosophy, studying books. So this is incredibly broad, incredibly flexible, and it's not really clear in what sense anyone should perceive this as a problem under any circumstances. Now, again, I just want to contrast this to something. I have my own biases here. If you replaced the word personal gain with gambling, all of a sudden I'm convinced this is a psychological problem. I think there's something really wrong with you if you're a compulsive gambler. Frankly, I don't even understand casual gambling or occasional gambling. But that's my bias. Like, I recognize that I'm prejudiced. What kind of prejudice would you have to perceive the pursuit of any kind of personal gain in this sense as problematic? Now, again, obviously this is not the full definition, but I'm starting by highlighting just how subjective and culturally conditioned the perception of this problem is. If you come from a deeply Christian, Western European cultural tradition, maybe you really do see this part of the definition of antisocial personality disorder. Maybe this really makes a lot of sense to you, that you think it's natural for people to be self-abnegating and humble and to not be motivated by a sense of self-esteem derived from personal gain. But even from a Buddhist perspective, even from a Japanese cultural perspective or something, this is pretty eyebrow-raising. Like, what do you mean? Or is there something implicit here in how you define some of these terms? Goal setting based on personal gratification. Again, obviously quoting this out of context, but you hear me, I'm reading in context. Goal setting based on personal gratification. Is that always a bad thing? I mean, again, if you replace the term personal gratification with gambling in a casino, all of a sudden, I'm biased in favor of this. But personal gratification can be anything. Personal gratification can be charity work. It can be finding the cure for cancer. It can be leading a movement for civil rights of an oppressed group of people. Personal gratification can mean a lot of things. And even if it doesn't, even if maybe somebody is somewhat shallow and stupid and their idea of personal gratification is somewhat humble, maybe my role if I'm in the role of a psychotherapist or something, maybe I have to sympathize with whatever the personal gratification is that rules their life to some extent. And I've already admitted to you, I have trouble sympathizing with someone who's a gambler or a compulsive gambler. For example, I don't regard all these things equally. Now, again, so paragraph B there, 1B, it also just stated failure to conform to lawful or culturally normative ethical behavior. Saudi Arabia. If you don't know anything about Saudi Arabia, just go to YouTube now and look at what life is like in Saudi Arabia. If I lived in Saudi Arabia, this would be true of myself, right? I would fail to conform to lawful, culturally normative ethical behavior in Saudi Arabia. Communist countries, fascist countries, Nazi Germany, take whatever extreme example you want, or take a very normal, mundane example of a country in the real world. Very often, people have legitimate reasons not to conform to lawful, culturally normative ethical behavior in the society they live in. And those may be deeply held, they may be carefully considered, or they may be irrational and spontaneous. Maybe you're a homosexual who grew up in a Muslim majority society, and you may not have a lot of philosophical depth in your sense of rebellion against those norms. All you know is you can't conform and you're not comfortable being part of this culture. For example, being a gay person in Saudi Arabia. We can fill in the blank. So again, these are very subjective judgments. They're very much culturally relative judgments. Okay, so move on. Paragraph 2A. Paragraph 2. Impairments in interpersonal functioning. A or B. A. Empathy. Lack of concern for feelings, needs, or suffering of others. Lack of remorse after hurting or mistreating another. Period. End of paragraph. We have one more paragraph to go here. This is something that's subjectively perceived or misperceived in such a dynamic and difficult to account for way. You guys may not know this about me. I was a scholar of Buddhism for 10 years, many years. I had many, many conversations with people in which, from my perspective, I was showing empathy. I was really making the effort to put them on game in terms of modern slang. I was trying to put someone on game. And they perceived me as having no empathy. They perceived me as being cruel, as having lack of concern for their feelings, needs, or suffering, of having no remorse. So here's the situation. I could give a million examples, and I knew other scholars of Buddhism who really felt the same way I did. A great example is Professor Richard Gombrich. Many people thought Richard Gombrich was a monster because of the way he treated students, the way he treated younger people with PhDs and this kind of thing. But I had sympathy for his situation, and he had sympathy for mine. We had some real interesting conversations. So let's say I have a conversation. I've already studied Buddhism for so many years, and I'm talking to a young person who has faith in this religion, and I'm really trying to tell them this ancient scripture, this ancient piece of paper that's written in a language you don't really understand. Maybe it's a language you just started studying, or a language you haven't started out. It's an ancient Buddhist scripture translated into English by a very biased translator. I'm trying to put you on game and let you know you're wrong. What you believe about this, you have been misled to some extent, and to some extent you're engaging in wishful thinking and misleading yourself. Am I being empathetic? Am I being compassionate? Or am I behaving, is this a symptom of antisocial personality disorder? Now, many of our interactions, especially in the workplace, really are this loaded and this complex. I don't care. You can be a tax attorney and you can be saying, hey, I really know what this piece of paper means. And you don't. You've misinterpreted it, or you don't have my experience. And I'm trying to let you know there's something that matters here. You can work in real estate. You can work in taxes. You can work in a million different... You could be in construction. And you can be saying to someone, look, you work in construction. You think you know how to use this piece of equipment safely. But I see what you're doing, and you don't. So when you have that kind of intervention with someone, are you showing concern, or are you showing lack of concern? Who makes that subjective judgment? And even worse, if you have the confessional setup of one therapist and one patient, there are no other witnesses. There are no facts. There's no appeal to the other side of the story. One person gets to tell their story from one side, and the therapist is supposed to come to these kinds of conclusions. So I remember one young woman, she had a PhD, so she wasn't that young. She had a PhD, and she talked to me about Buddhism, Buddhist philosophy, and some related things. And I know she broke down weeping about it, probably repeatedly, the conversation I had with her. I was just putting her on game. And I mean, I know in one case, because my wife at the time, now my ex-wife, witnessed her breaking down crying, talking about this advice I'd given. Nobody else is going to give her that advice. And I remember my ex-wife told me, when this woman was crying about it, my ex-wife said to her, like, I know how you feel, but Eisel is really being honest. Not many people are going to be honest with you. Not many people are going to tell you. Like, he's really, like, he's trying to help. Like, he's being honest with you. He's telling you, what the problem is. So, I mean, again, this is a really simple story. But that woman who broke down weeping because of my advice, if she goes and sits down with her psychotherapist and gives a one-sided account of this, And you can be in legal situations. Maybe she goes and sits down with the university authorities, or she sits down with the police and she tries to tell them that I have antisocial personality disorder. She can present this in a way where the problem is that I have no concern, no empathy, no, that she can present this in this manner. And maybe the reality is the exact opposite, or maybe it's an imperfect mix of the two, or maybe the questions we're asking are framing this with a set of criteria that are wildly spurious to what it is we're actually what we're trying to measure, what we're trying to gauge. If you bring the wrong instrument to measure this, you're going to get measurements that make no sense, right? You're going to get conflicting and contradictory data coming out of using an irrelevant measurement for what it is you're trying to measure. All right, and now we come to the fourth and final part of this first general thrust of the definition of antisocial personality disorder. 2B, number 2, section B, intimacy. Intimacy is an impairment in interpersonal functioning. The incapacity for mutually intimate relationships, as exploitation is a primary means of relating to others, including by deceit and coercion, use of dominance or intimidation to control others. Now here, for the first time in this article, in this entry in the DSM, I think we actually have the definition of a disorder. And I would say that the most fundamental underlying problem here is that this document is not written by one person. This is written by committee. Many, many people participated in this. And probably what they really need to do is take that part I just read you and make it the primary definition, or the whole, make it the essential criterion that separates this from the range of normal behavior, goal setting, self-esteem derived from gain, and this stuff. These are not hard criteria for a disorder. But here at last, we have a concept that could, I think, in different cultures and from different cultural perspectives, and including the subjective perspective of the person who may have the disorder, that here we have something that is truly disordered, and it's something that you might want to go to a therapist and try to get help for. Now, I'm going to read this again, with changing one word for clarification. I'll explain. Incapacity for mutually intimate relationships, because exploitation is a primary means of relating to others, including by deceit and coercion, use of dominance or intimidation to control others. So the only word I've changed there, they have the misleading word as in English, and really I think the word they need is because instead of as, because that's what's being implied here. So if that is your situation in life, that suddenly puts this whole question outside of the miasma of merely subjective and culturally normative judgments we can make. You say, oh, so you have a problem. Your problem is you can't have intimate relationships because these are the other things that dominate your life. And maybe there's some way you can improve this aspect of your character, or this, this rut you're stuck in as a human being, by talking about it with a therapist. Maybe. When I was discussing this with my girlfriend before filming the video, we were both reflecting on the extent to which these definitions are imperfect and fundamentally unscientific. Something my girlfriend said, contrasting this definition, the 2012 definition, to the earlier definitions of the same condition from a few years ago, DSM-4, DSM-3, you can see how radically the concept has changed. The scientific definition of this disease or this disorder has changed. And she said, well, this is ridiculous compared to, a real, medically real, verifiable condition like diabetes. The definition of diabetes is not going to change that much from one manual to the next. We see this being totally reinvented from the ground up. And my girlfriend asked me a very good question. She said, why do we need to create these definitions anyway? What is the point of defining and categorizing people in this way? And I jumped to answer. I said, there is one reason. There is just one very good reason. And the reason is so that you can help them. If it is possible to take this definition and link it to the experience of therapists, the experience of people in reaching out to, talking to, working through these problems with people and helping them. If there is some etiology to this type of behavior, or this type of, whatever you want to say, personality problem, characteristic, rut, and if therapists have the experience of talking to people with these problems and helping them through them, and either, nobody's going to talk about them being cured, but maybe they can discipline themselves in some way where they improve on their ability to have intimate relationships, and maybe they just do some crazy BDSM stuff on Saturdays and Sundays. Maybe they manage to become more aware of their tendency to be deceitful and coercive, and they can, I don't know, they can tune that out or tone that, maybe they can change. If there is some potential for helping people or talking through the problems, making people more aware of them and helping people to help themselves, that and that alone is the justification for why we medicalize what are ultimately in no way medical or scientific disorders. Okay, guys, thank you for joining me in this discussion of quote-unquote sociopathy. In the last year, I've done a lot of research into the state of psychiatry and psychotherapy that I didn't think I'd be doing, partly because different people in my life have prompted me again and again to do more research on antidepressants, the use of prescription psychiatric medication. And I've seen the extent to which we really are looking at a set of aesthetic moral judgments, highly subjective, highly culturally relative moral judgments that have come to be regarded as scientific facts. And it is now through social media, including here on YouTube, that I think people are starting to wake up to just how outrageous that is and how genuinely dangerous the consequences of that mode of thinking can be. Science is not dangerous. Scientism is dangerous. And it's scientism that grows out of the combination of ignorance and, frankly, moral self-righteousness that, psychiatric judgments, perhaps more than any other province of the sciences, they invite us to make these kinds of judgments. These kinds of judgments that all revolve around the self-centered egoic delusion of, oh, I would never do that. That would never happen to me. I could never imagine myself being in that situation because I'm not a sociopath. I don't have this disorder. I don't have this personality trait that somehow separates humanity into two different categories, those who are capable of evil and those who are incapable of evil. And it is much more humbling and indeed much more empathetic to look at these other people and to imagine yourself, even if it's just as a thought exercise, and really think through the extent to which you are capable of that same evil, or you are capable of making those same errors. And there is no simple medical or scientific fact that separates the perpetrator from the person who has not thus perpetrated. The lines we draw are ethical, and they are elective, and they are ultimately aesthetic. The difference between sane and insane is never going to be like the difference between someone who is diabetic and someone who is not diabetic. It's going to be much more like the difference between great poetry and bad poetry. It's going to rely on judgments that are very difficult to verify, just like the judgments I offered as examples, my behavior at that funeral, and so on, that may be perceived by one person as the pinnacle of compassion and may be perceived by someone else as utterly lacking in that same thing.